I often sit by the window, watching the world outside. The soft golden light of the afternoon sun fills my small apartment, casting long shadows across the floor. Outside, children run along the sidewalk, their laughter echoing through the streets. Their joy reminds me of a time when my own children were young, when life felt full of endless possibilities. I used to believe that if I poured all my love and effort into raising my children, they would always be by my side when I grew old. I never doubted it. That was how life was supposed to work, wasn't it? You raise them with love, guide them through childhood, and when the years take their toll on you, they return that love by taking care of you. When I was young, I met my husband at the hospital where we both worked as nurses. We built a life together, working long shifts, caring for patients, and raising three children. We were not wealthy, but we made enough to provide for them. Our eldest daughter was always ambitious. One day, she ran to me, gripping a toy stethoscope, and said, "Mama, I want to be a doctor when I grow up." My heart swelled with pride. My second daughter, quiet but determined, loved books. She spent hours reading and often spoke about becoming a teacher. My youngest, my only son, had a sharp mind for numbers, always solving problems beyond his age. My husband and I worked tirelessly for them. Every extra shift, every sleepless night, every moment of exhaustion, it was all worth it because we believed in their future. We sacrificed our time, our energy, our own dreams so they could have better ones. I remember the small joys of parenting, the first words they spoke, the way they ran into my arms after school, the nights spent helping them with their homework. In those moments, I felt certain we were building a family that would always remain close. I imagine my old age filled with warm dinners, surrounded by my grown children and their families, listening to their stories, laughing together. In my heart, I believed that a mother's love was an unbreakable thread, one that would always pull her children back home. But life is never as simple as we expect it to be. At first, the changes were subtle. The phone calls became less frequent, the visits shorter. I reassured myself that they were busy, that they had responsibilities. They'll call when they have time, I told myself. Then, one day, I realized I was waiting for a phone call that never came. I sat by the phone, staring at it, willing it to ring. But the silence stretched on, filling the room with a quiet loneliness I had never known before. And for the first time, a painful question crept into my mind. Did I give them so much that they forgot I existed? The first time I truly felt the distance between me and my children was during holidays. It had always been a tradition to gather as a family, to share meals, laughter, and stories. I would spend hours preparing their favorite dishes, setting the table just as I had when they were little. That year, I called each of them weeks in advance, excitedly asking about their plans. My eldest daughter sighed over the phone. "Mom, I'm on call at the hospital. It's impossible for me to get time off." My second daughter hesitated before saying, "The school is keeping me busy. Maybe next year, okay." My son barely let me finish before replying, "Mom, we're flying out of state for the holidays. It's just bad timing this year." I tried to hide my disappointment, to reassure them that it was okay. But after hanging up, I stood in my quiet kitchen, staring at the empty table, wondering when the tradition had stopped mattering. When did family stop being a priority? I sat alone that evening, eating the meal I had cooked out of habit. The food tasted different, dull, flavorless. Not because the recipe had changed, but because the people who made it special were no longer there. The excuses became routine. Birthdays were missed, anniversaries forgotten, phone calls reduced to quick check-ins. I learned not to expect too much. I told myself it was natural. Children grow up, they build their own lives. I repeated this to myself until it almost felt true. But the truth was I was lonely. There were moments when I would pick up the phone, wanting to hear their voices to ask how they were doing. But then I would hesitate. I didn't want to feel like a burden, like an obligation they had to fulfill. So I put the phone back down and waited. The waiting stretched into weeks, then months. One evening, I accidentally cut my finger while preparing dinner. It wasn't a deep wound, but the pain surprised me. Reflexively, I looked around, expecting to hear a voice ask, "Mom, are you okay?" But there was no one, just the hum of the refrigerator and the ticking of the clock on the wall. A realization settled in my chest, heavy, undeniable. I was no longer a part of their daily lives. I had become a distant memory, someone they thought of occasionally, someone they would visit when they had time. And maybe, just maybe, that time would never come. It happened on a cold winter morning. The frost had settled overnight, making the floor icy near my front door. I had woken up early, as usual, to start my day. The house was quiet, the kind of silence that had become too familiar. I reached for the morning newspaper outside my door, but the moment my foot touched the tile, I lost my balance. Everything happened so quickly. My body tilted forward, my arms flailed, and then, with a loud crash, I hit the ground. A sharp pain shot through my hip, so intense that for a moment I couldn't even cry out. My vision blurred, and I gasped for air as I tried to move. But I couldn't. My body refused to respond. I was alone, lying there on the cold floor. I realized the harsh truth. There was no one to help me. No child rushing to my side. No warm hands to lift me up. The house, once filled with laughter and chaos, was now nothing but empty walls and distant memories. I don't know how long I lay there, staring at the ceiling, feeling the weight of loneliness pressing down on me. The pain in my hip was unbearable, but the pain in my heart was even worse. Eventually, it was my neighbor, the woman from the apartment next door, who heard the sound of my fall. She knocked on my door, and when I didn't answer, she used her spare key to enter. Her eyes widened in shock as she rushed toward me. "Oh my God, are you all right?" she gasped, kneeling beside me. I wanted to say yes, that I was fine, but the truth was I wasn't. Tears welled to my eyes as I whispered, "I can't move." She immediately called an ambulance, her voice filled with urgency. Moments later, I was being lifted onto a stretcher, the flashing red and blue lights reflecting off the snow outside. As they wheeled me into the ambulance, a thought echoed in my mind. Will my children even know if something happened to me? At the hospital, doctors confirmed my worst fear. I had fractured my hip. Surgery was required, and recovery would take months. Lying in the sterile white hospital room, I finally picked up my phone and dialed my eldest daughter. She answered after several rings. "Mom, what's wrong?" Her voice was distant, distracted. I hesitated before speaking, my fingers trembling. "Sweetheart, I'm in the hospital. I had a bad fall and need surgery. Can you come?" There was silence on the line, then a sigh. "Oh, Mom, this week is really tough. I have important patients, and I can't just leave. But I'll check in, okay?" My heart sank. I forced a small smile, though she couldn't see it. "Of course, dear. I understand." I tried again. I called my second daughter. "Mom, I have final exams to grade. I'll come once the school term ends." I called my son. "I have an urgent business meeting. I'll visit as soon as I can." The same words, the same excuses. As I placed the phone down, my hands felt weak. I closed my eyes, trying to fight back the tears. In the beds beside me, other elderly patients had family members visiting them, holding their hands, feeding them, brushing their hair. The love in their eyes was undeniable. And yet, my bed remained empty. 3 children, but not a single one beside me. I had never felt lonelier in my entire life. The hospital stay was long, much longer than I had anticipated. The days passed slowly, each one blending into the next. Nurses came and went, doctors checked in with polite smiles, and other patients received daily visits from their loved ones. But for me, the only voices I heard were those of the hospital staff. I kept waiting, hoping that at least one of my children would walk through the door. Maybe my son would surprise me with flowers, or my eldest daughter would sit by my bedside, reassuring me that everything would be all right. But each passing day proved otherwise. I tried to distract myself by reading, by watching television, by making small talk with the elderly woman in the bed beside me. But nothing could take away the ache inside my chest. Then one afternoon, the phone rang. My heart leaped as I quickly reached for it. "Mom, how are you?" It was my second daughter. Her voice was warm but rushed, as if she was checking off an obligation. I forced a cheerful tone. "I'm recovering. The physical therapy is difficult, but I'm managing." "That's good to hear." A pause. "Listen, I heard from my brother that you're thinking about selling your house. Is that true?" I blinked. "How did you?" I stopped myself. Of course. My son must have mentioned it. "I was considering it," I admitted. "Living alone has been difficult. And after this fall, I don't think I can manage everything on my own anymore." "Well," she said, her voice suddenly lighter, "if you're selling, you should move closer to me. There are great retirement homes in my area." Before I could respond, another call came through. It was my eldest daughter. "Mom, I heard you might be selling the house," she said without greeting. "Listen, there are wonderful assisted living facilities in the city near my hospital. If you move here, I can visit you more often." The line beeped again. My son was calling. I let out a deep sigh and answered. "Mom, why don't you move to my city? There are excellent senior communities here. It will be the best option for you." Their words blurred together. Retirement homes, assisted living, facilities, communities. Not a single one of them said, "Come live with me, Mom." They were all offering solutions, but none of them were offering themselves. I listened to them talk, each try to convince me that their city was the best place for me. But I knew the truth. They were concerned about my well-being. They were concerned about what would happen to the house, the finances, the assets I had spent my life building. The realization hit me harder than the fall that had put me in the hospital. When I finally hung up, my hands trembled. My heart felt heavier than ever before. I had spent my whole life taking care of them. I had sacrificed everything to give them the best future possible. But in the end, I was just another responsibility they were trying to manage from a distance. I looked around the hospital room. The walls were stark and white, the beeping machines a constant reminder of my fragile state. And yet, for the first time in my life, I saw things with perfect clarity. I could no longer rely on my children. If I wanted to live with dignity, I would have to take care of myself. I wiped my eyes and took a deep breath. It was time to make a decision, not for them, but for me. The day I was discharged from the hospital, I returned to my home feeling like a stranger. The apartment, once a place of warmth and comfort, now felt foreign, too quiet, too empty. As I slowly walked inside, using my cane for support, I noticed the dust settling on the furniture, the untouched kitchen counters, the silence that seemed to stretch endlessly. I lowered myself into my favorite chair and let out a deep breath. The past few weeks had changed me. I was no longer the same woman who had entered that hospital. I had spent so many years believing that my children would always be there, but now I understood. I had to stop waiting for them. The next morning, I made a decision. I called a real estate agent and put my apartment up for sale. There was no hesitation, no second guessing. I knew what I needed to do. Not long after, the calls started coming in. My children, who had been too busy to visit while I was in the hospital, were suddenly eager to talk. "Mom, are you sure about selling the apartment?" my son asked, his voice laced with concern. "Yes, dear," I replied calmly. "It's time. But what about the money? What will you do with it?" "I'll use it to take care of myself. There was a long pause before he spoke again. Well, I just think we should discuss this as a family. I smiled sadly. You mean the family that didn't have time for me? I didn't say it out loud, but the silence on the other end of the call told me he understood. A week later, my eldest daughter called. Mom, if you're moving, you should consider an assisted living facility near me. That way, I can check on you. Check on me. Not live with me. Not care for me. Just check on me. I thanked her for her concern and told her I had already made arrangements. I chose a senior living community, not because my children suggested it, but because it was what I wanted. It was a place where I could be independent, surrounded by people my own age, with activities that kept me engaged. A place where I wouldn't have to feel like a forgotten burden. The day I moved in, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Relief. For the first time in a long time, I wasn't waiting for a phone call. I wasn't hoping for a visit that would never come. I was choosing my own happiness. I joined a gardening club and made friends who understood what it meant to grow old alone. We shared stories, laughed, and supported each other in ways our children never could. I took up painting, something I had always wanted to do, but never had time for. I found joy in the little things, waking up without expectations, having tea in the morning sun, going for walks without worrying if someone would call. One day, my son finally visited. He looked around the community, saw the life I had built for myself, and said, Mom, I didn't expect you to be so happy here. I smiled. That's because you thought I needed you to be happy. I had learned the most valuable lesson of all. Happiness doesn't come from waiting for love. It comes from learning to love yourself. Have you or someone you know ever experienced something similar? How do you feel about aging and independence? Where are you watching from? In your country, do elderly parents rely on their children, or do they live independently? If you found this story meaningful, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments. Your voice matters.